Hello, my name is Mauricio Anishi. I'm an assistant professor in software engineering at the Delft University of Technology. And on behalf of my colleagues, Frank and Feline, I'm going to present our paper, Grading 600 Plus Students, a case study on peer and self-grading. Let me start by giving you some context. TU Delft has been facing a large influx of computer science students. In the year of the case study, we received 900 first years, and by the end of the first year, which is when they take my software testing course, they were around 600 students. The lectures were even happening in the TU Delft auditorium, which you can see in the slides. An important part of the course was the lab work, or is the lab work, J-Pac-Man. J-Pac-Man is a Pac-Man game written in Java, and students have to apply different testing techniques to ensure that the game works properly. The assignment is composed of 4 parts. Every part is delivered by the students and then graded by our teaching assistants. The assignment was always done in pairs, also to reduce our workload. However, now with 600 plus students or 300 pairs of students, we needed a very large army of teaching assistants to help us in grading everything. And that's just too much work, too much time consuming. So we decided to explore some alternatives. And we came up with the conclusion, let's just try some self and peer grading. How did this work in practice? As I said, students work in pairs and they work on the different assignments we ask them to do. Once they are done, they deliver formally the assignment, which is then when the peer and self-grading process starts. So students would grade themselves, and then they would grade a random team that is assigned to them automatically by our tool. All the grading is supported by the very specific rubrics we devised. Those rubrics were basically multiple choice questions, and students would just have to pick the one that fit the most. And this is how we calculated the final grades. Also, as a sanity check mechanism, we looked at the ones where the difference between the self-grade and the peer grade was interesting, significant, and we then involved the teaching assistants and they also grade those deliverables. Of course, for this case study to be perfect, we would have paid teaching assistants to grade all the deliverables, but that was simply not possible due to many constraints. So we had to decide which assignments to grade, and as I said, the interesting ones, and we decided to involve TAs whenever there was a high difference between self and peer grade. And by high difference, we meant 25% difference. We also decided to investigate all the grades where both self and peer grades were very high, so higher than 90% in both. And then also we did some random checks by selecting random teams. At the end, we received 906 submissions that were self and peer graded, and 248 of those were actually double checked by our teaching assistants. We asked 3 research questions. How do peer and self grades compare to each other? Second question, how do TA grades compare to the self and peer grades? And third research question, do social demographic characteristics influence self and peer grades? For the first research question, what we observe is that on average, self grades tend to be 8 to 10% higher than the peer grades, which is quite expected. That was our hypothesis at the beginning, that students would give themselves a higher grade than the peers. Interesting to notice that around 25% of the teams gave themselves a self-grade lower than their peers. That is very interesting and a point of attention in practice. And of course, precise matches between the self-grade and the peer grade rarely happen. If we now compare to the grades that TAs would give to these assignments, what we notice is that the peer grades, they seem to be a good approximator of the TA grades. So in this picture, I show the third stratum, as we call in the paper, so the teams that were randomly selected by checks. This means they did not fit in any of the categories, so the difference was smaller than 25% between the self-grades and the peer grades, and the grades were not higher than 90%. You see that the second box plot, which is the difference between the peer grades and the TA's grades, they are near zero, which shows that the peers gave a very similar grade to the TAs. In the paper, we show the box plots for the other comparisons, for the other stratum. So grades that are very high, or grades that the self and peer were very different. And a second observation that we make is that when, in cases that the self grade and the peer grade diverge significantly, the TA grade lied in between. So students gave themselves a very high grade, peers gave this team a lower grade, and the TA grade was in between. Finally, when we tried to control for gender and nationality, we did not see any significant difference in the way different groups self-grade and grade others. So in this picture, I basically show teams that are composed only by men, and they do self-grading and peer grading, then groups that are composed only by women, and groups that are composed by men and women. And if you compare the two sets of box plots, there are no statistical significant differences. Of course, in practice, there might be differences at an individual level, and as a teacher, you should make sure that no one is harmed because of their own way of grading himself or herself. That is something I'll discuss in a minute. So after this analysis, what did we conclude? Well, we concluded that self and peer grades seem to be a viable alternative, at least for grading lab assignments like the ones we have right now. I did not mention this so far, but this assignment was responsible for 20% of the final grade. So also the importance of the assignment towards the big picture of the grade was not so big. So for this type of assignments, we believe self and peer grades are a good alternative, and it's just cheaper and easier to do than involving a very large army of TAs. In practice, we decided to pick the highest grade between the self and the peer, or the TA grade when the TAs graded it. Given that we noticed that the difference was not so big in the random groups, the highest grade seemed to be the most fair one to avoid any sort of discussions. Of course, this might mean we are giving high grades to students that do not deserve it, but again, this was just 20% of the overall grades, and the impact was not so large. Recommendations. So pay attention to the extra workload that this gives to students. So our students reported around 1 hour to self-grade and 1 hour to peer grade times 4. So this is 8 hours that they have to work more, and you have to balance this in the design of your course. Coming up with very good rubrics is an important point. Our rubrics evolved over time, over many years, and this is one of the factors that we believe made this experiment so successful. That was it. That was our case study. Let us know if you have any questions. Bye-bye.